Well, this is a wonderful turnout. Thank you all for coming with this forecast of deluge. It's wonderful to see this many folks here. And I really want to thank the Friends of the Library, as well as the library staff, for making this event possible, working to publicize it, working to put things together for it, and to draw everyone here. So thank you, library folk, very, very much. We have tonight a very special program. Catte is here to read from her book, What You Are Getting Wrong About Appalachia. I was maybe one of the first people on the pre-order list for this book on Amazon, and when I got it, I sat and I read it straight through. I mean, it is the kind of book that when you start reading it, you have to know where Liz is going to take you. Liz is an elegant writer as well as a passionate one. So those of you who like well-written books, you're going to go crazy on this. Some of you may have heard of this book because of its rather strange, blurby association with Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance's book. Liz takes issue, let's just say that, with a great deal of what's behind Vance's book. And I have to say that when I read Hillbilly Elegy, it left me completely puzzled. So when Liz's book came along, I was thrilled to have a place to come to. That's how I see it. Liz has her PhD from Middle Tennessee State University. She currently lives in Stanton, where she and her partner, Dr. Josh Howard, are co-directors of PASL, which is a nonprofit, pro bono historical consulting company. Now, what does that mean? That means that all of us who are living in small towns in Appalachia, and some not so small, have the opportunity to work with experts in grant applications, in working with public officials. They're here to help, and they do, and we're extremely fortunate to have them just 45 miles away. Kirkus Reviews is the tough pre-pub book journal. They're the ones that when you write a book, you want to have a good blurb from them, and if you do, you've got it made. Here's what Kirkus Reviews said about Liz's book. It is a bold refusal to submit to stereotypes. A bold refusal to submit to stereotypes. I will second that and say that Liz writes elegantly with no holds barred. We're very fortunate to have her here tonight. Liz?
Thank you so much, Joan. Thank you, Friends of the Library. Thank you for having me here tonight. I thought what we would do is I would read a small portion of my book to you just to show you some of the issues and complexities and topics that captured me. And then Josh and I would start a conversation, hopefully amongst some of us, so we can talk about what people have gotten wrong and right about Appalachia. I wrote this book because during the 2016 presidential election, there was a lot of focus on Appalachia. It sort of was endowed with a power that people who are from regions that are very poor don't often have, which is to make and create the shape of national politics. And if you are somebody who is been in the region for a few generations, or if you study the region, what you can clearly see is that there is a pattern of discovery that occurs in Appalachia, where people discover the problems and then they try to fix them. They tell us what we should do, what we shouldn't do, how we can, straighten ourselves up, and then they leave. And then the next generation, somebody else comes along, and that's very frustrating. It doesn't matter what your politics are, and it doesn't matter what your personal story is. The fact that people can kind of have a high perch, and look down on the region and kind of do this diagnostic thing was really, really offensive to me. So I wanted to correct some of that record and interrupt, more than correct, but interrupt the kind of power that people like that like to claim. not nice things to say about hillbilly elegy, but it has, more broadly speaking, these connections to these moments where Appalachia has been discovered or rediscovered. And it talks about the consequences that follow from that. So I want to read to you about how that took place, those consequences in the 1930s, up near my part of the world now, the Shenandoah Valley. It's so reminiscent, I think, of some of the issues that we're facing with the pipelines in Virginia. What occurred was a moment where the government used its consolidated authority to take land from people who were living in the Shenandoah Valley for the betterment of the region. And that's a story that's very common throughout Appalachia. And this particular slice of history has some pretty, I think, tragic consequences to it. So let me read. They didn't want something that looked good. They wanted to show the worst side, and they took pictures. Well, you've seen them. I know what they'll do with it. You see, movies are made about the South. There'll be hillbillies and the rough people. And when you see the movies, well, the people outside the South are viewing the community here. If it had all been spick and span and beautiful buildings, well, it wouldn't have been interesting to anybody. This quote comes from a man who was interviewed by historians in the 1970s. He is describing a photograph taken by Lewis Hine of the school that he attended with my great-grandfather. My maternal great-grandfather was born in Lewiston, Tennessee in 1896. In the 1930s, Hine accepted a commission from the federal government to photograph Lewiston residents before the government seized their land to facilitate the construction of rural development projects. The 1920s and the 1930s had become a critical decade in the construction of a mountain white, a peculiar specimen thought to stubbornly resist social and even genetic progress. A new class of reformers deployed both visual and graphic images of white Appalachians to demonstrate the dangers of clinging to the past at an age of what the government hoped would be unprecedented modernization. Hine, best known for his photographs that expose the horror of child labor, was not the only photographer commissioned to document the poor. The government employed a fleet of photographers, many through the Farm Security Administration, and the form of visual cataloging complemented the agency's aim to resettle individuals living on quote-unquote submarginal land as part of the larger New Deal effort to modernize America. The government justified its actions in the name of progress and leveraged the consolidated power of the federal government to modernize the rural poor by force, if necessary. Hine worked directly for the Tennessee Valley Authority, an agency best known for creating government-owned power-generating facilities. Most of Lewiston proper is now at the bottom of a man-made lake, sometimes called the Lewiston Sea, created by the TVA's Norris Dam project in 1936. My great-grandfather's land, however, was not submerged. Finding itself with surplus land, the government transferred ownership to the state of Tennessee for the creation of a state park at the site of the new lake. This was consistent with the government's broad aim to put submarginal land in the service of the public good. The problem, of course, was that the government had the sole authority to determine the definition of submarginal. Many residents, like the farmer that I just quoted, believed that the government, through selective photographic documentation and biased sociological studies, intentionally created a narrative that suited its purpose. My family was fortunate. Rural developers, photographers, and a new class of sociologists found them uninteresting on the whole and relocated them without the promised assistance to a community several miles away. Beyond Tennessee, some families met a dark fate. The FSA's fleet of photographers produced documentation of enormous cultural significance. We're all familiar, for example, with Dorothea Lange's photographs of Dust Bowl migrants, and many brilliant photographers honed their skills with the FSA. Gordon Parks, a magnetic African-American photographer, credited with forcing him to, quote, take a hard look backwards at history to realize the burdens of those who had lived through it. The experience, Parks remarked, made him much better prepared to the history yet to be made. Several of the subjects of FSA photographs became symbolic of their particular moment in history. Lange's migrant mother, Florence Owen Thompson, became a visual representation of the strength of motherhood in the wake of enormous social upheaval. The African-American cleaner Ella Watson, the subject of Parks' American Gothic image, became a symbolic representation of the unequal treatment of Black Americans during a time of progress. Less is known about the subject of author Rothstein's first assignment with the FSA. Rothstein would later become a prolific photographer with tenures at Look and Parade magazines, but in 1936, he was 21 years old and among the first photographers sent out on assignment by Roy Stryker, the head of the FSA's photographic unit. Rothstein's assignment was to document families living in the Shenandoah Valley soon to be evicted for the construction of a new national park. Momentum to establish a national park in the area had existed for some time. The government had authorized the Shenandoah National Park in 1926, much to the enthusiasm of local Virginia businessmen and politicians, but progress on the construction had moved slowly because approximately 500 families lived at the designated site. The state began to slowly acquire the necessary land through eminent domain, and in 1928, Virginia passed the Blanket Condemnation Act, which streamlined the state's acquisition of 200,000 acres of land to become the new national park. Much like the projects in the Tennessee Valley, the government framed the relocation of farmers as a benevolent process that would move residents geographically, not only temporally, but spatially, from the 19th to the 20th century. As you might imagine then, expert opinion that confirmed this perception was in high demand. The passage of the Condemnation Act brought many strangers with cameras to the Shenandoah Valley. Surveyors, social workers, academics, doctors, and photographers arrived to assess the residents and to initiate eviction processes. In 1933, journalist Thomas Henry and the University of Chicago sociologist named Mandel Sherman released The Hollow Folk, a book that purported to be a sociological study of the very people the government aimed to displace. Their work largely follows a pattern of casting mountaineers as primitive, isolated, backwards, people with a homogeneous white ethnic identity and monoculture created through idleness and inbreeding, they wrote. Social evolution presumably still goes on, but so slowly do groups go forward under their own power that no movement can be discerned throughout the generations. The less evolved individuals, expert argued, could only be saved through the intervention of outsiders. Henry and Sherman were assisted by the state social workers who helped them order the residents of the Shenandoah Valley into discrete geographical family units, the hollows of the Hollow Folk, which they then scaled from most evolved to least evolved. So they designated Colvin Hollow, quasi-fictitious name for the real Corbin Hollow, as the least evolved and most degraded. Henry and Sherman, with no small assistance from area social worker named Miriam Sizer, described the residents of Colvin Hollow as living in primitive squalor, subsisting on a diet of weeds and small vermin, and overrun with illegitimate children. According to two writers, these individuals knew little of the outside world and did not include in their basic vocabulary words of modern invention like post office. So the ghost of Henry and Sherman would like you to know that they were not eugenicists, but that doesn't matter because eugenicists loved their work, filled as it was with lurid descriptions of white mountaineers' degraded pioneer stock. Virginia was already at the forefront of the American eugenics movement, thanks to the Eugenics Record Office in Cold Springs Harbor, New York. This New York collective helped Virginia's politicians draft sterilization and racial integrity laws, and in 1927, the fruits of their labor blossomed when the infamous Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell effectively legalized compulsory eugenic sterilization nationwide, which was practiced in Virginia until 1979. According to Charles Davenport, the director of the Eugenics Record Office, Virginia's mountains were filled with mongrels of a, quote, combination of the worst traits of badly put together people. Many individuals thought to fit that description, like Carrie Buck, ended up at the Virginia State Colony for epileptics and feeble-minded, where they were sterilized, in the words of Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, prevent or being swamped with incompetence. Into this environment stepped author Rothstein, objective documentarian, or was he? In 2011, Rothstein's work in the Shenandoah Valley became the subject of a documentary by a man named Richard Knox Robinson, who produced a film called Rothstein's First Assignment. Robinson was himself a photographer and saw in Rothstein's photographs striking parallels to the narrative embedded in Hollow Folk. Rothstein extensively photographed, for example, the residents of Colvin Hollow, including the mother of 4 illegitimate children, who so captivated Hollow Folk's authors. Robinson suggested it was if Rothstein used descriptions of subjects in Hollow Folk to guide his photographic eye, a not unlikely crutch for a new photographer to use, ignoring the presence and evictions of more modern residents who own gas stations and restaurants. Rothstein delivered a photographic portfolio that shored up a narrative of the Shenandoah Valley as a place forgotten by time and progress. Curiously, the mountaineers identified by both Rothstein and the authors of Hollow Folk as the most degenerate lived in an area of the Shenandoah Valley closest to the developed areas of the future national park, where wealthy businessmen hoped to accelerate evictions to begin expansion of new construction of vacation resorts. Many of them even worked at the Skyline Resort, which hoped to offer luxury accommodations to new visitors of the park. What became of these mountaineers following their evictions was not widely known until Robinson set his documentary in motion. Although the government successfully relocated some mountaineers, others were destined for the colony. This process appears to have begun during the writing of Hollow Folk, during which time the authors had frequent contact with area physicians and social workers. Roy Sexton, an area doctor, wrote to Horace Albright, who is the director of the National Park Service, after the survey is done, we'll colonize the worst of the bunch, a sinister play on the eugenics institution's abbreviated name. Robinson found that the state authorized the institutionalization of at least 11 members of the family that populated Colvin Hollow at the colony, and 9 of them were children. Rothstein was present when social workers took away 2 children for institutionalization, and he photographed them just days prior. In the early 1990s, the National Park Service funded a series of archaeological studies of the Shenandoah Valley, and one focused on the settlement site vacated by the evicted residents. In Corbin Hollow, archaeologists found mass-produced furniture, toys, modern medicines, records, specialized farm equipment, shoes, an assortment of dining ware, and even an automobile. The most moving discovery to me was a Maxwell Parrish calendar from 1931. Parrish was a particularly striking illustrator known for his modern and vibrant colors, who often incorporated drawing techniques to give his illustrations a 3-dimensional feel. He was, in other words, an artist of his time, and the residents of Corbin Hollow decorated their home with his art because, contrary to belief, they were people of their time as well. Okay. No.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks, Liz. So now we're going to move into part 2. We're going to have a discussion.
Just a couple questions.
Just a couple of questions from me to get it started, and then we'll take any questions from the audience that we have, and we'll try to get it.
Conversation.
Yeah, conversation, structured conversation, whatever you want to call it. So, in doing these events, the elephant that is always in the room with this book is J.D. Vance and Hillbilly Elegy, without question. Just curious, because I'll do this in every talk, how many of you have read Hillbilly Elegy, just so we know what's up? So, the vast majority of you have read Hillbilly Elegy. So, the question for Liz really is just like, why do we not like J.D. Vance? I'm just kidding. Why do we hate this guy? No. So in Liz's book, there's a quite large section about Hillbilly Elegy and about J.D. Vance. But kind of one of the big purposes is why is it so, explain how J.D. Vance Hillbilly Elegy is nothing new. That this is not really a new thing that he is doing. Like, why do you say that? What do you mean by that? How is his story familiar in a way?
So when I talk about this book, I almost wish, I can't bear to own it anymore, but I wish I had it so I could show you the subtitle of the book, which is A Family and Culture in Crisis. Now, I don't have anything to say about the story of the family that's in this book. It's harrowing. It's, and it's relatable, but what I'm interested in is what a memoir of a culture is. This is not a thing that exists. This is not a thing that should exist. If you wanted to write a study, there's a word that we have called ethnography. There's different ways that we can write about cultures ethically or appropriately. But what J.D. Vance does is he uses his childhood to extrapolate and generalize about a region that is about 25 million people, 700,000 square miles. It's 13 states, or the portions of 13 states, and the entire state of West Virginia. And so I am obsessed with kind of understanding, why someone would feel entitled to do that, but more importantly, why everyone let him get away with it. Why is it so that this book is a bestseller? Why is it so that when smart people in college campuses, for example, and people who write for the New York Times want to understand Appalachia, they pick up this book, and then they put down that book, and then they never read anything about Appalachia ever again. And the argument that I like to take is that this tendency to carry a sense of entitlement to tell the story of an entire region is something that's very familiar. All of the people who have stepped forward to be explainers of Appalachia kind of fits. They share some characteristics. They're very well educated compared to their neighbors. They're all whites. They're all men. They always embrace this feeling of being both of a people and also above them. There's a class difference at work as well. And so Harry Caudle, who wrote Night Comes to the Cumberlands, is another example of that. Jack Weller, who wrote Yesterday's People, is another example. There's lots of examples of people who didn't write but did photography projects. For example, Shelby Lee Adams, who does harrowing black and white portraits of people trapped in poverty, is another example. And so what is clear to me is that this is a trend, and that there's always some kind of commercial purpose in mind. People like to say that they're, they're civic-minded, but usually it's, Appalachia is a thing, it's a place we live, but it's also a market. It's also an idea. It's also an idea that can be bought and sold. And so this is something that looms large when in these conversations that that people are having about hillbilly elegy with me, the idea that if you trace a bad take or a bad idea about Appalachia further back enough, you'll find somebody making a profit. And that's narratives like hillbilly elegy, or it's the coal industry, or the gas industry. These ideas produce consequences, and these consequences are often material in nature as well.
So, follow-up to that is you mentioned that phenomenon where J.D. Vance has become the spokesperson of a region. He probably embraced it, but he was created in a way too. But a function of that too is, you mentioned New York Times journalist, the hypothetical New York Times journalist that reads one book about Appalachia and then they move on, or they go to the parties down the street, they interview one person, and that's good enough to tell a story about Appalachia, is that one person's idea. So another giant chunk of Liz's book is kind of addressing journalism. So I guess the simple way to word it is, how do we start doing good journalism? Appalachia.
I mean, that is above my pay grade to solve. I think, the answer to that is, it takes money. It takes money. I like to interject money into all the conversations and points that I'm making about Appalachia, because the chasm between power and powerlessness is often one of access to resources and capital. There are tons of people in our communities, probably even in this room, that could do a wonderful job talking about their regions, telling their stories, changing the conversation, but they don't have support for their work. They don't have the salary to do that. They don't have the tools the tools that you need. They don't have the time. Time is money. So these are kind of things, these are questions that people like you and I and people in this room can't really solve, but we need to, be real and address that these are dilemmas in the way that journalism is practiced. Journalism is often a profession that is most accessible to people of means. And so when you read their stories, you're reading the perspectives of people with means. So we need to have a lot more people who've experienced poverty in journalism. We need to diversify journalism, not just people from Ivy Leagues, not just people from journalism school. We need to have more women in journalism. We need to have more African Americans and more people in color in journalism. These are all things that need to be done. One of the things that we're seeing now is that there will be a sustained focus on Appalachia because of the presidential election and because of sort of the kind of mea culpas and my bads that kind of went around after the election when people said, that coverage that we produced really wasn't the quality that it should have been. We really kind of were operating from an outcome that didn't happen. And so the balance that we'll need to think about is this going to be a good thing, or is this another example of people coming in and trying to fix us, to put people in the communities and try to make things better? And I think that my sense of pessimism is that it will be a continuation of a trend, but I think that one thing that somebody like me can do is to help people feel more empowered to tell their stories, to interrupt the power that is in these narratives a little bit more, so that people can kind of run with that and do something and tell something and make a different story.
So I think we might turn to the
Yeah,
audience
that would
now.
be great.
Yeah. So now opens part 3, where you guys get to talk too. And we hopefully, Liz can talk more about her book and interjected with some of the questions, or even just kind of loose ideas you might have to talk about Appalachia, or journalism, or Vance, or whatever. Go ahead, Jen.
Well, I have about 1,800 questions, but that's okay. I'm just going to ask one.
Yeah.
So I was really taken with what you just said about how we can find ways to give voice or to hear voice of people whose voices we don't often hear. How do you do that?
Give them money. so they can. I mean, there's no other way to do it except to make sure that people can support themselves while they're telling their stories. And traditionally, the way that has happened is that people go to school and they learn a craft, and then they get compensated to practice that craft, and that is a model that's falling away for a lot of different reasons. So I think that in respect to Appalachia, there are then things that we can do, and those include maybe starting community groups to pool our resources together to support each other. This also helps us perhaps access different kinds of funding. So we can apply for a grant together. We can have a project that we're all working on together. We can have support and accountability. We can connect one another to different sources of grant funding or community partnerships that might be able to support our work. There's strength in numbers, essentially, is my operating, the way that I operate in kind of thinking about this. There's great ways there's organizations out there that are doing a great job supporting writers that don't fit the mold, and like the Economic Hardship Reporting Project is one, and then there's, just a reassuringly enormous amount of organizations that are committed to doing better, and those include the place where I work, Belt Magazine, but that includes Scalawag. Local radio stations are a great kind of source to tell different stories about the region. But it also takes pushing back too. When somebody says something about your region that is wrong, you have to tell them that they're wrong. Or somebody does. You don't have to, but somebody needs to. And I think so often, we grumble amongst ourselves, and then we just kind of like try to shake it off and kind of like brush it off and keep moving. But we all have a part to play in this, and that the part that some people will play is just being a bit more forceful about lodging critiques from within about some of these issues.